Two balls and a strike to count on Taylor. Reyes fires, swinging a drive, deep left field. It's his way back. Walk the ball. Chris Taylor.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today by special guest Pedro Moura, the author of a new book that's coming out this week, How to Beat a Broken Game, The Rise of the Dodgers in a League on a Brink. Pedro is also a national baseball writer for Fox Sports, spent time at The Athletic, the LA Times. Pedro, we're 2 weeks away from opening day, less than 2 weeks away from opening day. Are we ready for it?
I imagine everyone watching this is ready. I think, understandably, this probably came as a surprise to most of us, to you, Jeff, to me. But, getting ready. I mean, we have a couple weeks, as you said, and I'm certainly not upset that baseball's coming back sooner than I expected. It'll be nice to be able to tune in as pretty much as normal. The opening day of my youth was often like April 4th, April 5th. So it feels like an April 7th day is almost like nothing changed.
Totally. Well, I want to get into some specific 2022 Dodger talk, but first let's talk a little bit about the book, because as I thought about Major League Baseball and sort of zoomed out on the league and the collective bargaining agreement that was just reached, I feel like after reading your book, you have done some deep thinking on some of the bigger questions that I think face Major League Baseball. So let me ask a giant question to you to start us off, which is this. How would you describe the state of Major League Baseball heading into the 2022 season?
It's such a good question, such a hard question to answer, because there's so much conflicting evidence, right? Like in a lot of ways, I think baseball's in bad position. Mm-hmm. The game is getting less entertaining. There's fewer balls in play, far fewer. The athletes are better than ever, but they're not on display, in most cases, on most nights, in most major league ballparks. But there's a lot of potential still. And at the same time, as given what I just said, the owners are still raking in the money, as the early end to the CBA stall sort of revealed, right, that they were willing to hand over, somewhat significant sums to the players, after holding out for a couple months, because they stood to still gain a lot from staging a full 162 game season. And so the players were able to get, some pretty significant new money in the collective bargaining agreement that I think only comes from the fact that the owners are still making plenty, and and even the billionaires are willing to share a piece of their pie. So I don't know what the state of the game is. The state of the game is both really good and really bad, depending on what part of it you're examining.
Yeah, it feels like the question is how we define success, because clearly the number one sort of marker for the owners and the players is financial success, at which everybody's doing great. Corey Seager just signed a 10-year, $325 million contract. Guys are getting paid more than ever. Forbes just came out with franchise valuations, and the Dodgers are worth $4 billion, supposedly. So that side is going well. But what I love about this book, which sort of explores both the 2020 Dodgers and the World Series and sort of almost like biographical chapters on a number of the key figures, it also, when you talk about how to beat a broken game, the broken game in your estimation is sort of the collision of two separate things. On one hand, the thing that makes teams successful in 2020, 2021, 2022 is also what makes them, in a lot of ways, unenjoyable to watch and uninteresting. And you get into the high strikeout rates, shifting, openers, tanking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my question with all that in mind is, having just come out of a lockout, having just come out of a new collective bargaining agreement, I think most people would agree that the game is less nationally appealing than it has ever been. It is less interesting to young people than it has ever been. And people are going to respond by saying, well, I'm a young person and I like it, or I love my team. Sure. But there are, statistically, you can look at any metric and there are seemingly less people on a national audience watching these games. And yet, were you surprised that the owners and the players did essentially nothing to fix that in the last collective bargaining agreement? All they did was argue about money. They did nothing to fix the state of the game. They just argued over which side of the ledger a few dollars ends up on.
Yeah. Well, am I surprised? No, because that's the reason the game has gotten to this point, right? Is because it's been ignored. The problems have been ignored. The rise of the home run confused us, and we thought that was going to be good for the product. And it turns out that home runs, strikeouts, and walks are not good for the product. But you can understand why at first, when homers started to increase in this century, we thought that was a good thing. I mean, that was what brought baseball fans back to the game in '98, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one reason I'm a fan of baseball, is because of the increase in the steroid era. But I would say also, I think it would be unfair to not note that the owners and players did seem to make some progress on instituting rule changes starting in 2023. It sounds like the defensive shift will be maybe not banned, but restricted come the following season. And I think, if that actually happens, that's definitely an encouraging sign. You might disagree. People might disagree on whether the banning of the shift is a good or bad thing for the game. But I would argue, no matter your opinion, it's still a good sign, because it means that the league is taking decisive action to try to fix what has gone wrong. And one rule change is certainly not going to be the end all be all fix, by no means. But I think, if you start to do that, you're going to incentivize players to put the ball in play more. If you start to limit the intensity, if you create some rules that limit the intensity with which pitchers are throwing, so they're not going 100% for 90 pitches, I think that could help. Things like that. And it seems like the league is taking some steps, probably not as fast as I'd argue they should. Yeah. Right. When Rob Manfred took the job, he was speaking about banning the shift, as I note in the book. And, he's done nothing since then, and he had the opportunity to. It's not that there was nothing other than just choosing not to. Yeah. So I guess, there's an element of I'll believe it when I see it in terms of their rule changes. But I think it would be unfair for me to say that they made absolutely no progress. I think it's totally fair to say they didn't make as much as you want. But yeah. Maybe in a year we'll look back and say, hey, they actually did make some.
What would you say to, because I get these people a lot in the comments and questions that are asked of me, which are, well, all these rule changes are changing the game. Like just force guys to go hit the other way. Like, we shouldn't be instituting rule changes, banning the shift. Guys could learn, and it's tradition, and it's the way the game is played, and we're messing with it. And if you're a true baseball fan, like you would be fine with all of this. That kind of, how do you respond to that as somebody, again, who's thought probably more deeply and with a wider scope about this than most?
Yeah, I think that's a fair rejoinder. I mean, I think I hear that from people within the game a fair amount, that they're against it. A lot of traditionalists within the game. I mean, I think if you polled every scout employed by a major league team, you'd probably get more people against banning the shift than for it. What I would say is, and then I've also, heard scouts point out, I think the first time this was pointed out to me was actually by a major league scout, that the NBA banning what is it? How long you can spend in the key? How is that different than orchestrating how many defenders can be on one side of the infield on a baseball diamond? It's and that wasn't always the case. Rule changes happen all the time to incentivize entertainment in a sporting event. I mean, the 3-point, the 3-point line in basketball has been a huge boon for the sport. And it just so happens that basketball, the analytics that have guided that sport this century, they've instructed teams to do the more interesting things. Yeah. They've incentivized them to dunk and shoot threes and not shoot mid-range jumpers. In baseball, they tell you to only swing for the fences. That's an oversimplification, but it's basically true. Yeah. And maybe that sounds like the same thing as shooting 3-pointers, but it's not, because home runs mean strikeouts, and strikeouts are not fun to watch after the 4th or 5th in the game, unless you have a starting pitcher going for 15 or something like that. But when is a starting pitcher going to throw 15 strikeouts these days? Because he's not getting past the 100 pitches. So it's this complicated cocktail of stuff that just has made the sport less entertaining.
Yeah. Okay, let me ask you, put you on the spot here. If Rob Manfred calls you up and he says, Pedro, all right, I have space to make 3 rule changes, and you can pick any 3, okay? But I want 2 of them to be within the realm of normal conversation. But then he says, I'm going to give you freedom to do something absolutely crazy with the 3rd one. Like something that maybe people aren't talking about. Like you mentioned, maybe it's forcing a starting pitcher to throw you have to throw a certain number of pitches, or whatever it is, something that's a little more outside the box. What would you come up with as your 3? Hey, these are the 3 things I would start with.
That's a good question. Okay. I'm not always good at discerning what's outside the box, but I think what I would try to move toward is a roster where teams cannot staff as many pitchers as they have now.
Okay.
And I would do that as an indirect way of forcing pitchers to throw deep into games. So and less intensely with each throw.
Okay.
But you cannot do that suddenly, because that would create some serious problems within the sport. Right? I mean, if you ask every pitcher to pitch the way they did last season, but also throw 120 or 130 pitches in each game, that's going to create problems, right?
Yeah.
People are going to get hurt. But I would like to move toward a 10-person pitching staff.
Okay.
I think, which I think would remove the cases where big playoff moments are being decided by pitchers that only the most rabid fans know on even their teams, right?
Yeah.
And that is something that the other sports just don't have. And that's a real problem in baseball relative to basketball, and it's getting worse and worse. I mean, relieving has obviously been around a long time, but there weren't nearly as many relievers, right? And I would question, like, in the 2021 NLDS, like, what percentage of Dodger fans watching the game knew Evan Phillips's name,
Yeah.
right? And this is a person who had an impactful, part on their performance. So I would want to move away from that. So that's a winding way of saying something like, I think that's fairly outside the box. I agree. A 10-person pitching staff, I would say, is pretty outside the box, and that's going to be a transition. Maybe you take away one spot every year, something like that. And then I would ban the shift. I would, to protest from fans and from people and from everyone, and people would hate it at first, but I think they would realize that it's not, nobody actually enjoys watching the shift. We like to see balls in play, and when hitters are shifted against, they've started to accept that they're going to hit into an easy out, and so they just swing for the fences. So if you move that, I'm open to the specifics of how it would be enforced. It could be that you could have a foot in the grass or something like that. We'll see. But something like that would be a rule, would be a priority for me. And then the third one,
you a pitch clock guy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have some scout friends and some friends who work in the minor leagues, and if you talk to anyone who was around I believe it was called the Low A West last year, and then it was since changed back rightfully to the California League. Last year, after the pitch clock was introduced, people have described their lives improving dramatically once it was introduced. I'm telling you, like, I know people who say that they were like their entire families were happier after the pitch clock was introduced. That it changed their lives. Yeah, straight up. So I think that when I hear that, it's hard for me to in practice think that it would make that significant of a change, but I will defer to the people who have lived experience with it. And the last 3 months of last season in the minors seem to indicate that it would help.
Yeah, let's get that on. I mean, pitch clocks changed my life. Like, let's get some bumper stickers going. That needs to be the new slogan for this kind of thing.
Have you noticed Major League Baseball, in its marketing of it, is not using the word clock. So, if you use that, you're going counter to what they want. They're using pitch timer. Because, of course, they can say there's no clocks in baseball still. Okay. There's no clocks in baseball. I think that's a traditionalist marketing specific thing that they want to keep. So now every release says pitch timer, not pitch clock.
Now, are you on board with the only other one I was thinking of that has gained steam is sort of the starting pitcher DH, the double hook, that kind of a thing? Are you on board with sort of you can only have a DH in the lineup as long as your starting pitcher is still on the mound? It seems to fit with your sort of general premise of get starting pitchers to go past 5 innings.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, shoot, if you just mandated they finish 5 innings, that would help a lot. Yeah. I like that rule. I think Jason Stark, my former colleague at The Athletic, was involved in popularizing that, maybe even creating it. And I like it a lot. I think anything you can do to incentivize starting pitching extending into games is valuable. That's what we want to watch as consumers of the game. And it's a shame when, a star is removed in the 4th inning of a high-profile regular season or postseason game, postseason especially, because, a 4-inning 1-run start in the postseason is like a success these days. Yeah. And then, it is followed by a bunch of relievers who, 5-10% of the fans know who are watching the game. And that's not a good product for anyone.
I would argue, though, Blake Snell having to come out of the World Series was a good product for baseball and for the Dodgers specifically. So anything that allows Kevin Cash to remove Blake Snell in that game, I'm very in favor of. I just want that on the record.
For the Dodgers, yes. I mean, the thing with that game is that Blake Snell, I mean, he had never the facts are in the book that he hadn't pitched 7 innings in like 2.5 years at that point. Like this is not, he's not, there was never a threat that he was going to go complete game. Like imagine a team extending a guy 13 outs past his norm over the last 2 years in the biggest game of the season. That was never going to happen, right? The most they were going to get out of him was 1 more inning. And that's, that's really something when you think about it.
To be clear, though, I do know what it's like as a Dodger fan to see a starting pitcher extended far beyond what he should be capable of in postseason moments. So, unfortunately, I do have experience with, hey, Clayton, just go get us 9 more outs. Hey, why don't you come back 2 days later and face Juan Soto and see what happens, you know?
It's a good product in the sense that, like, you know, it creates, you know, and you could argue the Blake Snell thing was good for the game in the sense that, like, people were talking about it, right? You know, Clayton Kershaw's past postseason failure certainly provided a lot of material to the talk shows, right? I can't recall many things in baseball being talked about more than that, right? Than like that narrative. People love to talk about that narrative of, you know, of Clayton Kershaw failing in the postseason. So
well, the 10 pitchers, that's a new one. I haven't heard that. I mean, I'm with you, like, philosophically, anything we can do to get starting pitchers to have to pitch later into games, I'm with you in complete agreement. I think that is like a benefit, it's less pitching changes. It would speed up the game a little bit. I like the idea of shortening bullpens, all that. So
to be fair, it would be extremely hard to introduce. Like it's a far-fetched thing from the beginning. Like the players' union would definitely not oppose it, or would definitely not support it. Because it would take away jobs from relievers. And I'm open to, maybe 10 is too tight, but I like the idea of, because the idea is that you're no longer pitching the way you used to pitch. You are pitching less intensely, but trying to go deeper in the game. And that's what we want from the starters and from the relievers. I think that would really help. And I'm open to anything that would help guide the sport to be less of 100% intensity pitch at all times and more towards 90% the way it used to be.
Yeah, and maybe an alternative that would be less offensive to the Players Association would be something like a maximum number of pitchers that can be used in one game. Like, it's like, all right, you have 4 pitchers can pitch. Now, if it goes to extra innings, then you add. I mean, because all of these, you're sort of creating a scenario where some guy is getting shelled in the second inning, and you have to do the math in your head of, do we just leave this guy out there because we can't really afford to pull him right now? But something like that, I think, would be compelling and interesting. So.
Yeah, I'm with you.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit. One of the things as a Dodger fan I like most about this book is sort of a lot of the chapters felt almost like mini biographies of some of the key figures. There's a Mookie Betts chapter, a Justin Turner chapter, Andrew Friedman, some behind the scenes analytics type folks that many Dodger fans would not be familiar with. So I think Dodger fans would love that. I want to ask something specifically about the Justin Turner piece. It was not necessarily a quote, but it was something that Sam Fuld, who's now the Philadelphia Phillies general manager, said. And as he was talking about Justin Turner, he basically said Turner is, I'll put it in my words, the guy who sort of started the whole analytical revolution on the players' side. And I had never thought about it like that. But if you go back and say who was sort of the first success story of all of this, taking a guy, you know, with no other explanation. It wasn't like, oh, well, he's young and he developed. It was like he was late in his career and now everything turned around for him. Like, do you think that's a fair assessment? Because I had never thought about it before like that.
I absolutely think it's a fair assessment. You know, I don't know that I had thought about it exactly either. And that's the value of, you know, of talking to people, right? And who know more about it than you, right? That when it was in a conversation in an interview. And then I think at one point I didn't go in seeking to ask him like who started this. It was more like we were talking about that, and then at one point I just said, well, like, I mean, who do you point to as the beginner, as the progenitor of this? And he literally just pointed to the other side of the dugout at Dodger Stadium, and it was like JT. And I was like, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, that kind of makes sense. The reason I didn't think about it is because, as I try to point out in the book, like Turner's reinvention, it wasn't exactly analytically fueled. He worked with a private hitting coach who was, you know, very much an outsider within the game, or outside of the game, I should say. And for that reason, like his reinvention, I think was without much precedent at all.
Yeah.
And it happened that what he changed in his swing was statistically backed, but it was not done for that purpose. It was not done to be statistically efficient. It was done because that's what Doug Latta, his private hitting coach, had long believed was the most effective swing. And so it's a little irony that the guy who's credited and I think fairly for starting this trend, didn't actually knowingly do so. But understands now the benefits of it and has espoused them to teammates and to people around the game. It seems like every spring training there's a new batch of hitters who've worked with worked in Turner style with Latta. Just yesterday or today I saw a report in The Athletic from Lindsay Adler about Isaiah Kiner-Falefa, who worked there, and his swing looks a lot like Justin Turner's right now. And I think it's really fair to say that is the beginning of this next stage where, for a while, the teams were using analytics to evaluate players and going out and acquiring players who did the things that the data showed them was most valuable. And then the players started to take back control and make those changes within their games themselves, separate from the team. And then the team started to do them themselves.
Yeah. It's so fascinating that something is so statistical, so analytical. The first guy did it on accident. Like everything in this movement now feels so thought out, so intentional, so like, hey, do this, put the second baseman here because 33% of the time they're going to hit the ball there. And yet, and accident is the wrong thing because it was a guy who had a theory and maybe not the numbers to justify his theory. But it's funny that it wasn't like some statistical analytical nerd that was the sort of the first pusher of this movement. It was an old school baseball hitting coach who was just like, hey, just hit the ball in the air more. That's better than hitting it on the ground,
Yeah, exactly. It's something in between an accident and in a purposeful experiment, right?
Yeah.
It's in that window, and maybe that's what's so charming about it, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's like the fact that it wasn't wholly intentional and designed and optimized. Maybe that's why Justin Turner's been such a beloved figure here in Los Angeles since that time, and maybe that's why he's been such a successful evangelist for that approach in baseball, is that it was authentic and not and maybe not forced.
Yeah. Well, and he's the perfect guy because it was sort of the journeyman guy who he wasn't crazy athletic. There was nothing else that you could point to other than the change in swing. It was the only possible explanation. And then you have this lovable figure. You have the local kid. Like the whole story behind it is such a compelling thing. It wasn't like Jaron Kendall or somebody who had all the raw tools imaginable as a Dodger prospect and just couldn't make contact. And then it was like, well, maybe it's not the launch angle thing. Maybe it's this other thing. Turner, it's like, no, this is it. This is the only possible explanation.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. And Turner had, not that you said otherwise, but Turner had all the, not the raw tools, but the refined tools, right? Like the stuff that came from a lifetime in the game, right? Like, I mean, if you look back at his career before the swing change, this is a pretty successful
he wasn't terrible.
hitter. I mean, for a guy not trying to hit home runs, he was pretty solid, like nearly league average as a utility man. And I think that's quite an accomplishment when you look at a 29, about to be 30-year-old who's made a lifetime in the game with really like only the tools of innate talent.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you one more question about the book. It goes to the Andrew Friedman chapter, which again, this is the guy who is the architect of the dynasty, if you want to call it that the Dodgers are in the midst of. I will call it that. The level of success that they have had. He's the mastermind. One of the most perplexing moments of the Friedman era, and you probably already know where I'm going with this because you talk about it a bunch in the book, is the decision to sign Trevor Bauer. It just felt like it didn't fit with everything else that he had done and the intentionality that he had talked about and sort of the clubhouse culture. There were just so many pieces to it that then they signed Trevor Bauer, and on the baseball field side, you're like, this is great. They're going out, they're spending money, this guy's a Cy Young. But all the other pieces, it just felt like something was slightly off. And obviously, the way the past couple of years have played out, regardless of what you think about Trevor Bauer, he has barely played for the Dodgers. And so I'm curious, in your research and talking to people, like, how did this signing happen?
Well, it's a good question. The signing happened, in my understanding, is the signing happened because the Dodgers believed he was one of the most talented pitchers the game had ever seen. And they had the opportunity to sign him on a deal that they termed to be deeply favorable to them because it was not a long-term commitment.
Okay.
And they were enticed by that. They really want to form a dynasty in Los Angeles with the Dodgers franchise and have this be, the most successful team that's ever existed in professional sports in America, and I think they have that chance, actually.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that's outside the realm of possibility. I wouldn't, not that you did, but I wouldn't put them in that realm yet, but it's I don't know when they're not going to win,
Yeah.
90 games. And so when you have a consistent ability to get to the postseason, and that, I think it would only be fair to project them to win a World Series some point between now and, the end of this decade.
Yeah.
So I think, and if you add in 2 or 3 more, then all of a sudden, that's one of the most effective, organizations that the North American sports complex has ever seen. So I think they saw the ability to like speed that up and to get even closer to that, and they were desperate to do it, and so they disregarded they disregarded the evidence that this player came with, with the history of antagonizing people on the internet, which is not a crime, but is problematic behavior from a professional athlete with a massive platform. And they knew that he did these things, and they talked about them with him, and he did not give any indications when they signed him that he apologized for them, or was going to change the way he behaved on the internet. And they accepted it anyway because he was a really good pitcher on a short-term contract, and then it got worse, and he was involved in, alleged assault and in court and out of the roster for the last 3+ months of the season. And there's no end in sight necessarily. A suspension is likely looming here. So why did they do this? Because they are desperately want to win. The same reason they do everything else, right? Just it was just more misguided, would be my argument in this case. And they disregarded the evidence that a lot of other teams did not in pursuing Bauer, and they were tempted by the fact that he was on a short-term contract, and they thought he would be really good, and he was, in the first half of the season. I think a lot of people within the game were curious what kind of pitcher he was going to be if he kept pitching with the without the aid of sticky stuff, but we don't know yet if what kind of pitcher he is, and so I would chalk it all up to desperation. The same, and maybe it's mostly the same as what guides the rest of their moves. But I think, and I try to make this argument in the book, is they were so desperate to succeed at that time that they did things that they wouldn't normally do. In the past, they've been really patient. They've waited out a lot of the top free agents to sign only to work out only the best moves, really. I mean, like, Mookie Betts doesn't come to LA if they signed Bryce Harper earlier, right? And the reason they got Mookie Betts for such a great deal was because San Diego didn't have the payroll flexibility to acquire Mookie Betts, even though they wanted him just as bad as the Dodgers did. But because the Dodgers had been patient, and of course they have more money, yes, but they had not spent. They'd opted against spending it earlier, and they had displayed a ton of patience. And I would argue the Dodgers weren't as patient in that moment. And a year ago around this time when they decided to sign Bauer.
One follow-up on that, it's sort of two-parter. How do you think this plays out with the Dodgers and Bauer specifically? And then as somebody who's connected league-wide, I mean, I can't help but you and I are talking today on Friday, and Deshaun Watson was just introduced as a member of the Cleveland Browns. The NFL, clearly a bunch of teams around the league had zero issue with trading for and extending Deshaun Watson. I get the sense that Major League Baseball is a dramatically different world on that front. So one is, do you think he pitches for the Dodgers again? And two is, if the answer to that is no, do you think there is interest around the league in Bauer still?
These are great questions. It can be hard to figure out what teams are willing to accept. Yeah. And I don't know the answer to really any of your questions. I mean, frankly, as someone who doesn't follow a lot of the NFL, but obviously followed the horrific allegations against Deshaun Watson, it is sort of blowing my mind that he is was traded for what he was traded for, that he's been given the contract that he's been given, especially with like the backload, the orchestration of the deal, so that he stands to lose little if he's suspended. I mean, the arrangement of that and the idea that that's acceptable is surprising to me, I guess, to say the least. And so I don't know. I don't know what, I think it's notable that like Roberto Osuna, by all accounts, a very good pitcher, did not spend last season in the major leagues, even though he is in his prime. I believe he's 27, 28 years old, pitched in Mexico, dominated. And nothing has changed for him, in terms of crimes he has been known to have committed since the Astros traded for him, right?
Yeah.
The Houston Astros were willing to trade for him from Toronto to be a force in their bullpen and accept the public relations hit that came from employing a player involved in that. Since then, no one else has been willing to in Major League Baseball, right? Yeah. And so I think it's hard to say what will happen in these cases. And Bauer has obviously not been convicted of anything. It's hard to say what will happen because all it takes is one team. Right. It's all it takes is one team. Yeah. I can say that my understanding is that a lot of players in the sport are uncomfortable with the idea of being teammates with the player who admitted to doing what Bauer has admitted to in his lawyer's statements. And that's by no means would I say that that's all of them. Nor could I ever claim to have been in contact with all of them. But I question, in some rooms, I think that would certainly be unwelcome. Whether that'll be the deciding factor, we don't know. I mean, players don't make the roster decisions, right? It's the executives making these roster decisions. And Bauer has been at times in the past, well, long before any of these allegations, he's been known to be an unwelcome clubhouse presence. So it's not up to the players to decide who they acquire. So I say all this to say, I don't know if he will pitch for the Dodgers. The reporting that is out there already has indicated that the Dodgers do not expect him to play for their team. Whether he will play for someone else again in Major League Baseball, I don't know. There's a lot of years in his, theoretically in his career left. I could see an executive, wanting that pitcher on their roster. I could see an owner wanting to win desperately enough, and that's what I try to lay out in the book. Is that the problem the sport faces, and maybe the biggest problem, is that there's so many teams that are using the ownership of a major league squad as an ability to make money, and they don't care what happens with the squad. They don't care if they win or lose, as long as they make money, which they do because of the way it's a monopoly and it continues to churn money. And then there are some select few teams that care so much they're willing to accept anything to win. And I'm not sure either of those is really a good thing. Yeah. Which is kind of unfortunate, I'm sure, to hear from fans, and you of course can disagree, but it's when you look at it that way, it's sort of it's disheartening. Yeah.
I've never thought about it that way, that you sort of have the extreme. I saw some stat. The Oakland A's have spent $0 in free agency this offseason. There's teams with payrolls of $30 million. So you have teams on that end who could not care less about being competitive, and yet on the other hand, you have teams that are making, desperate decisions in the search of victories and that kind of a thing, and not caring. So it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah, and just to add to your point, which is well taken about the A's, is it's the reason the A's are doing that is because that's what the CBA, the CBA is structured in such a way that when you're not going to win, the smartest thing to do is to move all your assets away from the current roster. Yeah. Right. Even with the draft lottery, it's still going to be the case that if you're not going to win, if you don't have a chance to win 85 plus games, you're best served losing, 95 plus games and getting yourself saving all your money for the future, or still earning a profit, still getting in that revenue sharing percentage, and pushing your assets towards the future.
Yeah. Okay, let's shift to 2022 and the Dodgers. We'll sort of piggyback on the Bauer conversation. Let's operate under the assumption that Bauer does not pitch for the Dodgers in 2022. We've looked at every metric imaginable. The Dodgers are massive favorites. Of course, it's baseball, so that doesn't guarantee you anything, but it's a good starting place. The biggest question that I get all of the time from people that are engaging with our show, watching the Dodgers, is this. Do the Dodgers have enough starting pitching to win? We know what the lineup is. We'll talk about the lineup in a moment. I think the bullpen's way better than people give it credit for. The pitching, great, top three, and a whole heck of a lot of question marks after that. So the simple question, do the Dodgers have enough starting pitching as constructed to win a World Series?
Yeah, hell yeah. I mean, they won a World Series with less, at the time in 2020. That was obviously a strange season. There's also, of course, not that you would forget this, but there exists a very real possibility that they could go out and acquire more at the trade deadline. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, if yes, Clayton Kershaw comes with injury concerns for certain, but he's also Clayton Kershaw, and he slates to be their number 3 starter, and that's not a bad outcome.
Yeah.
And the team is built in such a way that if Tyler Anderson is making 30 starts, which I don't expect, but if he is, the team projects to win more of those games than they would lose, right? And so if your number 5 starter, if you're still winning, half of his starts, you're going to be just fine. You're going to be just fine. And I of course, with the Dodgers, there's going to be, double-digit dudes making starts. Starts may only entail 3, 4, 5 innings at various times this season. And it's really not about the 162 starts, but it's about the innings that they're going to have to take on throughout the season out of the bullpen or the rotation. And I think, yes, they do. I think if one of Andrew Heaney or Tyler Anderson emerges as a solid number 4, or a guy you wouldn't mind starting in the postseason, that'd be great. Do I expect that? Probably not, but I mean, Andrew Heaney comes with a significant prospect pedigree. Obviously, the Dodgers think they can morph him back into the effective pitcher he has been at times in his career. I think they also have some potential there with the likes of Ryan Pepio that it wouldn't be that surprising to me if he emerges as an effective arm, in down the summer sometime. And there exists the possibility that Dustin May reemerges from Tommy John surgery and is available to pitch, sometime down the stretch or in the postseason. Yeah. If your biggest deficiency is who's starting your number 3, your game 3 of the postseason for you right now, I get that. You'd like to have that sorted out, but they have a lot of options. Kershaw's one option. Yeah. Dustin May is one option. Any of their prospects, another option.
All right. One other question I wanted to ask you, sort of not on the pitching side, on the offensive side. Again, I appreciate the fact that you're a national writer. So yes, you're very familiar with the Dodgers, but you're also sort of plugged into sort of a bigger perspective than maybe some of us can be in local markets. The Dodgers lineup to me is insane. Like, even when I see other teams talk about how great their lineup is, and then I look at the Dodgers, it feels like the Dodgers are fielding an all-star team. It feels silly to ask a question like, is this the best lineup that we've ever seen? But how actually impressive does this lineup feel to you when you look across the landscape of the game?
Very impressive. Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are no mediocre hitters in it, and that's a huge strength. I think the Toronto lineup also projects to be really, really good this season. Probably I'd favor the Dodgers, but what I would say is that, this is essentially the same Dodgers lineup that they had down the stretch last season. I think Freddie Freeman and Corey Seager are pretty actually somewhat similar hitters. Yeah. They play different positions, but they're the same sort of bat in there, and middle of the order, left-handed contact and power bats. And so this was a really good lineup last year too, and it didn't win because they didn't hit in the postseason. And Trey Turner was a real concern in the postseason, and it's not a guarantee. Obviously, not that you're saying it is. So I think this projects to be the best lineup in baseball. It also, there are some concerns. I mean, we can list what is Cody Bellinger going to be this season? Who knows? Yeah. Is Max Muncy going to have the power that he did while he's recovering from an elbow injury? Is age finally going to catch up to Justin Turner? Yeah. Can Mookie Betts stay healthy? I think that's a lesser question than the other ones. I project him to, I would still expect him to be a really good player. But there's questions there. AJ Pollock is aging, and had a great season last season, but that was, a real bounce back. And can he sustain that? Yes, the overall, the short answer is yes, this projects to be the best lineup in the sport. I wouldn't be surprised if every one of those dudes has an OPS plus of 110 or better this year. Yeah. It's just not a guarantee because Cody Bellinger's been, one of the most fluctuating hitters in the sport. He's been both great, awful, and good. Yeah. And kind of okay too. He's been basically every tier. Yeah. And so, even if that's the strength of the Dodgers, is even if he's bad again, they're still going to be good.
Yeah.
They're still going to be fine, and they'll rotate in Chris Taylor to play that role, and they'll be just fine. And they're insulated against the non-performance that other teams cannot insulate against when you're talking about a star player. Like, I mean, Cody Bellinger's non-performance will affect the Dodgers less than any player of his caliber's non-performance would affect their team.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned Freddie Freeman. How were you surprised? I mean, what level of surprise on a scale of 1 to 10? How surprised were you to see him land in LA?
5.
Okay.
I most of that is because I didn't expect him to lead Atlanta.
Yeah.
If you had told me at the start of the offseason he was after game 6 of the 2021 World Series, if you told me Freddie Freeman was not signing with the Braves, I would have said there was I would have picked the Dodgers as the most likely team in the sport for him to sign with, other than the Braves.
Yeah.
But I'm still surprised that did not come together. I thought that they would have valued that relationship from a franchise perspective more than they proved to ultimately. It's not surprising to me at all that the Dodgers pounced on it, because the way they see it, they're getting essentially the same hitter who may be better at a different position, but who's as good or better at that position, probably better at that position than Seager was at his, and they're getting that player for half the cost. Yeah. And by acquiring him, they're shifting the rest of their defense and really not getting worse at any defensive position, and doing so for half the cost and 4 years shorter of a commitment. So it's a pretty easy to grasp transaction from their perspective, right? Yeah. And especially with the DH, there's what's the worst case scenario for Freddie Freeman's final few years? Totally. He projects to be really good the next couple of years. There's no doubt about that. And even then, near the end, you're still talking about basically the worst case scenario is at the end of the deal, he's like a 1-win designated hitter. Yeah. Who those sort of players sign for $10 million these days. And so I don't. If that's the worst case scenario, and he helps you win at least one World Series over the first 4 or 5 years of that deal, seems totally fine to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I keep telling people the last years of Freddie Freeman's deal, he'll be Justin Turner's age right now. So, looking at Justin Turner, Freddie Freeman is starting from a much higher level than Justin. He's starting from an MVP level. So even if he declines at a rate similar to Turner, I don't know how you could argue that the end of that contract would be brutal. And I'd rather bet on year 6 of Freddie Freeman than year 8 of Corey Seager, personally, with just an injury history and that kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Corey Seager is that when he is at his best, he's like the best hitter I've ever seen. Yeah. But how often has he been at his best? Freddie Freeman has been, I think it's fair to say, a more consistently productive hitter over the last 6 years since Corey Seager emerged in the major leagues. Yeah. And for the Dodgers, I totally get why they value that. I would caution against Justin Turner's career has been an outlier across the board, right? Fair. And he's at an age where it would not, he's 37 years old. It would not be surprising to people within the game if he took a step back at some point. That's not a slight to him to say that 37-year-old players often take steps back. And so, it would not be a slight to Freddie Freeman if at 36 he lost significant bat speed and was no longer able to hit 35 home runs in a season. Yeah. And so that's the risk you take, but I think you're betting on a player who's savvy enough as a hitter and has enough strike zone discernment that there's almost no way he's not at least a competent, valuable hitter at 36, at 37.
Totally. All fair points. All right, last one. Do you have a World Series pick? I mean, I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but a couple weeks away.
Yeah, let's see. I'll go Dodgers and Blue Jays.
Okay, I was going to say, those are the two lineups you just mentioned. So Dodgers, and who you got winning that one?
You can ask me by the day and the week, and it'll change. It's hard for me at this point in the season to bet against the Dodgers. They have the most talent on the roster. They have the most spending money, and they have the biggest ability, or one of the biggest abilities in the sport, to use prospects to go acquire more talent. Yeah. So knowing that, yes, there are deficiencies within the current squad. And by no means am I guaranteeing I'm not pulling a Dave Roberts here and guaranteeing a championship. But it's just if I have to pick one, I'm picking the Dodgers.
Okay. I love it. Well, that's Pedro Moura, national baseball writer for Fox Sports, also the author of How to Beat a Broken Game, out March 29th. I believe you can buy it everywhere. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get books. So, Pedro, we appreciate the time. Thank you for joining us. And for folks watching, we appreciate you as well. If you're checking this out on podcast form, please subscribe, rate, and review. If you're checking us out on YouTube, please subscribe and ring the notification bell as well. We appreciate you joining us. As we've said, baseball opening day just a little bit away. So we appreciate it. We'll see you soon.